In this example, I want to go through a working example of creating an AWS CI/CD pipeline. And the way the pipeline is going to work is that your developer tools will sit over here on the left-hand side. And for our developer tools, fairly straightforward, but we're going to have Visual Studio Code and React. And the idea would be that once we've developed our React application, we would then push that React application out to GitHub. Once we push it out to GitHub, this drawing is kind of misleading because it's kind of one directional from GitHub to AWS CodePipeline, and it's really two directional. But AWS CodePipeline would then recognize that there was a change in your GitHub repository, and you can do that on a repository or on a branch. There's different filters you can set up, and we'll see that within AWS CodePipeline. But AWS CodePipeline would kick off and basically get your code ready for production. And what that means for a React application is it would run that build process and create a static website. And then that static website would ultimately get deployed out to AWS S3. Okay, so this is the working example that I want to go through. I am being a little bit misleading in terms of what our developer platform is. So Visual Studio Code and React are really what we're going to use. But in order to use those tools, we're going to need Node.js, which comes with npm. And then, even though it's a little bit dated, we're still going to use Create React App. I haven't moved over to Next at this point. I don't necessarily care for server components. It just introduces some headaches. So the Create React app is installed as well. Okay, so that's kind of the developer tools that we have. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the desktop, and I'm going to create a new folder for this project. So I'm just going to call this P4. And then I want to open that in Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to open up a terminal. I'm going to change my working directory to that P4 directory. And then I'm going to launch into Visual Studio Code. Okay, I'm just going to expand Visual Studio Code so it's kind of taking up my screen so we don't have the background noise. Within Visual Studio Code, there are no files or folders yet. It's just an empty folder, but that folder is living here inside of Visual Studio Code. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a new terminal window. And in the terminal window, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run Create React App. If you don't have Create React App installed, or if you get an error message when you try to run the command npx Create React App, if you don't have that installed, you're going to do an npm install, and I typically will install it globally of Create React App. Okay, so I've already done that. You may have to do that after you've installed Node and npm, but I've already done that. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use np execute npx. So I'm going to execute the command create React App, and I'm just going to say I want to create that React App in my current directory. If I didn't have a P4 directory, I could say create a React App called P4. I don't want to do that again because then I'll have P4 nested within P4. I just want to create the application in this P4 folder, and the dot is representing the current directory. So I'm going to create this React application. Okay, and you'll see it's kicking off that Create React App script. And while that's going on, I'm going to skip over to my browser and get a couple of other things done. Okay, so I'm going to skip over to my browser. And the first thing I'm going to do is I need to create an S3 bucket where my static website is going to live. Okay, so I'm going to create a bucket. And just to kind of as a reminder, what we're talking about is ultimately our React application is going to end up in S3. In order for it to end up in S3, I have to have a bucket that's capable of static website hosting that's publicly accessible. Okay, so I'm going to set up kind of this destination for our code. Okay, so I'm creating a general purpose bucket. I'm going to call it CFD P4, Cloud for Developers P4. Okay, I'm not going to block public access. It's a website. I want the public to be able to access it. And that's the only setting I'm going to set. And then within this bucket, there's a couple of things that I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the properties and enable static website hosting at the very bottom. So I'll enable that. As far as index document, I'm going to use index.html. In the error document, I'm also going to use index.html. This has to do with a React application. It's kind of a side effect of using a React application. Your error document is typically index.html as well if you end up using a React router. Okay, so I've enabled static website hosting. And then in the permissions, I'm actually I have blocking public access turned off, but I'm also going to create a bucket policy. So I'm going to edit this and I'm going to add a bucket policy which makes this bucket publicly accessible. So I'm going to go to the policy generator. I'm building an S3 bucket policy for everyone. I want everyone to be able to access the files, which is the get object action. And then the Amazon resource name is ARN:AWS:/S3: my bucket name. So in this case, it's P4 CFD. Okay. And if I try to generate the policy, I think I actually messed up, but I'll try to generate the policy. The resource is not just this bucket, it's all the files inside of the bucket, so I need a /* there. I'm going to go ahead and copy this, but I know that I have to actually edit the resource. And you'll notice I got the bucket name wrong. I reversed these two. So what I'm going to do is I'll fix that as well. Okay, it would have caught it when I tried to save the changes. It would have said, hey, this bucket doesn't exist. But I caught it, so I'll go ahead and save those changes. So now we have this bucket policy that makes all the files in the bucket public. Okay. If I go back over to Visual Studio Code, you can see that the process of creating this React application finished. Okay, so it tells me I was successful. You can see that the project folder now has files and folders that are inside of the directory. So the P4 directory is no longer empty. If I scroll up a little bit, you'll see what actually happened is that it installed the necessary packages for React. Okay, so it did that. It initialized a Git repository. It installed template dependencies. And then it created a Git commit. Okay, and then it says if you actually want to see the application, you can use npm start. And if you want to build it into a production application, you use npm run build. Okay, and then you can also test it and eject. So let's go ahead and try to see what this actually looks like. I'm just going to use npm start. And you'll notice that it's running on my local machine on port 3000. And eventually we get the kind of hello world React application that comes from the Create React app. And it tells me that if I want to modify this file, I can edit the source file, so source directory app.js file, and then reload this. So if I skip over to Visual Studio Code, you can see that there's a source directory, and then this app.js file that it's referring to is actually what's rendering that content that's getting rendered on the page. So if I just get rid of all of this stuff, so I have my app here, and I replace it with my first React app. Okay, so fairly simple. It's saying, hey, I don't know, logo is defined, but it's never used. Okay, so we have this logo. I could clean that up. So I'm getting some ESLint messages, but now you'll see that it actually built successfully, and you'll notice that I get my first React app. Okay, if I say, you know, hello world, save it, and then jump over to the browser, it'll automatically get updated. So this is the application. And if you want to dig into React a little bit, the only thing I will say, I'll kind of give you a quick intro. If I go to the public directory, there's an HTML file. This HTML file is really your starting point, this index.html file. And you'll notice that there's basically an HTML body, no script tag, basically saying you need JavaScript to run a React application. And then there's a div with an ID of root. Okay, so this div with an ID of root is an important part of this. Okay, so I have this index.html file that is then linked to index.js. Okay, so index.js is right here. So index.js, what it does is it creates a reference to that root element. Okay, so right here it creates a reference to that root element, and then you'll notice it does root, so that variable, .render, and it renders a React application. It renders app. So app is a React component that lives in app.js. So app is the name of the component, and it lives in app.js. So these three files are linked together. Index.html has that root element. Index.js replaces the root element with app, and then app is the component that gets rendered. Okay, and here's where the name app comes from, and that's where that component gets rendered. Okay, so that's how they're linked together. Okay, but ultimately, at this point, I would suggest that this React application, even though we want it to be a static website that's going to be hosted in S3, I would argue that right now this React application is more of a Node.js application than anything else. And what I mean by that is you'll notice that it has a bunch of dependencies. It has this package.json file that lists all the dependencies, these React dependencies, just like a Node.js application. And then these React dependencies ultimately manifest into this Node modules folder. Okay, so this is where all the Node.js dependencies are located, in the node_modules folder. Okay, so ultimately I would argue that this is a Node.js project right now that can't be rendered as a static website. Okay, what we ultimately need to do is we need to convert this Node.js application over to a static website that can run in S3. And the way we do that, so I'm just going to come down to the terminal window and stop the application. So I hit Control-C to stop the application so it's no longer running. And what I want to do is, if you look, right now there's three folders. There's node modules, there's public, and source. What I want to do is I want to run the command npm run build. And what this does is it transforms that Node.js application into a static HTML and JavaScript website. Okay, and now you'll notice this fourth folder here is this build folder that has the static website. Okay. So at this point, if I take this static website, right, all the stuff that's under build, and I deploy it out to S3, we would have a React application running in S3. Okay, and I can show you that. So if I go over to S3, okay, so we have our bucket already set up. Let's go to the objects. I'm going to go ahead and upload. I'm going to upload all the files. I don't want the containing folder. I don't want the P4 folder. I want all the files in the folder. Sorry. I don't want the build folder. I want all the files inside of the build folder, but not the build folder itself. So I want all these files. And then I also want to add the folder, which is static, which contains all the JavaScript and CSS. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and upload those. Once all those files have been uploaded, then I should be able to go back to the bucket and go to the properties and see the static website URL. And I should be able to open that static website URL. And it should be my React application. Okay, so my React application started as a Node.js application, but ultimately that npm run build command transformed it from a Node.js application to a static website, a React application. Okay, so that's how that's happening. Okay, and that's the same website that we're seeing on our local machine. Okay, so this is the local instance. This is the instance that's actually part of our S3 bucket. Okay, ultimately what I want to do is I want my source code to live inside of GitHub. Okay, so I've logged into GitHub already. I have a GitHub account. I'm logged in. I'm going to go ahead and create a new repository for this Project 4 site that we're using right now. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new repository. I'm just going to call it P4. I'm going to make it public. I don't know that it matters whether it's public or private. I'm just making it public. I create the repository, and it gives me some information about creating a repository from the command line. I should have mentioned this earlier. When I go back over to my dev tools, I have Visual Studio Code and I have React. I also have Git installed. So if I'm on a Windows machine, I would not automatically have Git installed, but if I'm on a non-Windows machine, I think I'll probably have Git installed. But you may need a local copy of Git. I may need to download a local copy of Git. Okay? But I did not include that here in the developer tools. Okay, and what I mean by that is I need to be able to manage Git locally before I can actually push out to GitHub. Okay. So in GitHub, I have this repository. It tells me I can initialize a local Git repository. I can add a file to the local Git repository. I can commit to the local Git repository. I can connect to the branch. I can remote add. I can do a push. A couple of things. This git init has already happened. The first commit has actually already happened. So I can actually jump to this step. And the reason I can jump to this step is because I've already done the git init, and I've already added the files, and I've already done the first commit. And that was all done when I did the create React app command from the terminal window. Okay, so if I come over to my developer tools and I say I want to, I don't know where I was typing there. I want to do a git branch. The branch that I want to select is main. Okay, so I'm on the main branch. Okay, I can add this remote destination. So I have this GitHub repository defined by this URL right here. I have this GitHub repository. What I'm really doing here is I'm saying that I'm going to add a variable called origin that points at this remote GitHub repository. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add that. I'll just copy the command. Okay, once I've done that, then I should be able to take my local Git repository that I have, the local files, my local React application, and I should be able to push it out to my remote repository. Okay, when I do that, you notice it automatically just kind of pushed out the 22 objects. So that all happened. It actually wrote them. For you, it may cause a delay. So if I'm working on my non-development machine and I haven't authenticated into GitHub, there's quite a time delay before it actually brings up the GitHub prompt to authenticate with GitHub. And with GitHub, you can sign in with your username and password, or you can sign in with a personal access token, but you are going to have to authenticate with GitHub if you haven't already done it. Okay, but ultimately, by me pushing those files out to GitHub, what I should see, instead of this splash screen saying how to do this quick setup, now I should see my files for my React application. Okay, you'll notice that I have two folders, public and source, and then the package.json file. So these were all edited 14 minutes ago. It was initialized using create React app. If I look at the source, remember we modified app.js to be a hello world version of it. If I click on app.js, it doesn't actually have that change. So it has kind of the initialization of that file. So I want to show you how to change this project. So if I go back over to GitHub, what I can do is I can add my file, so that source file, source, and then app.js. I can do a commit with a message, modified app.js to be a hello world version, and I need a lowercase m here. Okay, so I just committed it, and then once I've committed it, now I should be able to push that change out to GitHub. Okay, so now that I've pushed that change out to GitHub, I should be able to refresh this file and see that it's been modified to that hello world version. Okay, so that's how I track changes in my source code. Okay, so I'm able to make changes locally and then add, commit, push. Okay, is kind of the workflow that I'm using here. Okay, I'll also have you notice that there's a couple of folders that did not get pushed out to GitHub. So if I go to GitHub, there's really two folders in this repository, the public folder and the source folder. But if I compare that to what's on my local machine, the node modules folder and the build folder are not pushed out to GitHub, and that has to do with this git ignore file. So if I go to the git ignore file, you can see that I ignore the node modules folder, and then I also ignore the build folder. Okay, so it's telling me what files to ignore. As you dig deeper into developing a React application, you'll notice also the environment files are not loaded. That's typically where you'd have credentials, usernames and passwords and things like that. So those don't get actually pushed out to GitHub. Okay, so just kind of a tour of the environment. Okay, so now at this point I think we have everything set up the way we'd like. We're able to work on our React application on our local machine. We're able to then commit that code out to GitHub. And then ultimately, once we push it out to GitHub, we want the destination to be our S3 bucket that we have set up. And right now we've tested it, so if we have a React application, a working React application that we're able to build, then we're able to push that from our local machine, localhost 3000, out to our AWS website. Okay, and that's where we're working right now. Okay, so we have pieces of this all put together. We have our local environment, we have GitHub, we have our S3, and now we want AWS CodePipeline to get involved and to automate some of this work so that as I make a change on my local machine and commit it to GitHub, I want it to automatically be deployed out to S3. Okay, so just for our purposes, let's go ahead and make a change. So right now, our local machine is showing hello world in that app.js file. So our local machine and the AWS website are both showing that. What I want to do is I want to modify our local website. So I'm just going to go back to app.js. And instead of hello world, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say hello Madison, Wisconsin. Okay. So I've modified that file. On my local machine, I can see that change. So I can do npm start. And then on localhost 3000, we'll see when this refreshes, we get hello Madison, Wisconsin. Okay, so we get that change. But on a remote machine, we still have hello world. Okay, so in the cloud, we actually have hello world. Our changes from our development environment have not actually been deployed out to our S3 bucket. Okay, and I want to automate that process. So I could come back over to my local machine. I could run npm run build. It will recreate this build folder. The build folder will have files that I could then upload to S3, and then we'd see the changes. But I want to automate that process. Okay, the way I'm going to automate that process is with CodePipeline. Okay, so I have CodePipeline here. It's already open. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a code pipeline. And when I create a pipeline, there's really two things that happen. I create a pipeline, but then I also describe a build project as well. The pipeline does three things. It goes and gets your source code from GitHub. It then builds that source code, so it actually does all the things that we would do. Mainly, it's going to install Node, which includes npm and React. It's going to do that install. It's going to run the command npm run build, so we get our build directory. And then once we have our build directory, it's going to go ahead and deploy those files out to our S3 bucket. So it retrieves code from GitHub, it builds our project, and then it deploys. So it does those three things. The build portion of it is actually its own separate tool. Okay, so it's called CodeBuild, and we'll see that when we create a pipeline. It's going to jump us out to CodeBuild, but let's go ahead and create a pipeline. Okay, so I'm going to build a custom pipeline. My pipeline is going to be CFD P4. It's going to be a queued version 2 pipeline. I'm going to create a new service role. And that's the only thing I've changed right now, so it's just the name of the pipeline. Where I'm going to get my source code is I'm going to get GitHub via a GitHub app. It's going to ask me to connect to GitHub. And when I connect to GitHub, I've already done this a bunch of times, so I'm going to name the connection. I'm going to connect to GitHub. And I've already done this, so I'm going to authorize this connector. It's going to go into the code star. It's actually going to ask me to install the GitHub app, and you will have to do that. So what that does is it basically establishes a connection between your AWS account and GitHub, so it can actually monitor. It's really a webhook that's monitoring your specific repository for changes. So I've already done this. You'll basically authorize AWS connector for GitHub. You'll install the GitHub app, and that's really in the AWS cloud. It's not on your local machine. And then you'll have an AWS connection. I already have a connection, so here's my GitHub connection. And then it knows what repositories I have. And then the branches of that repository, well, we only have one branch. Okay. I'm going to do the CodePipeline default. That's fine. I am not specifying a filter. So the filter will let you look for specific branches. It'll let you look for specific branches. I'm going to use no filter. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and hit next. The build provider, I can enter individual commands. Okay, so the build provider necessarily is going to install Node.js because we need a Node.js environment to actually do the build. And then once we have Node.js, we have to do the npm install for our application, and then we have to run the build command. So those are the types of things that need to be done. All of that is specified in a buildspec.yml file. Okay, I could enter those commands, but there's really a file that's done that for us. So if I go back over to my desktop, I have that buildspec.yml file. Okay, let's just open the buildspec.yml file. The buildspec.yml file doesn't do a ton of stuff. You will notice that it is indented. The indentation is important for this buildspec.yml file, but you'll notice what it does is it requests us to install the Node.js version 20. It echoes out, so there's really phases that we're going to go through. The install phase installs Node.js. The pre-build phase, before we're actually building our code, runs the command to install the dependencies for our React application with the npm install. And then finally, when we're building it, it runs the command npm run build. So install, pre-build, build are the different phases that we have. And then once we've done that, we get artifacts, and it basically says where are those artifacts actually stored in the base directory. There's actually a directory called build. Okay, so that's really what's going on in this build spec file. Okay, so I'm going to use a build provider, and that build provider is AWS CodeBuild. And what AWS CodeBuild does is it basically says, hey, I'm going to create a virtual environment for you to do those things that were defined in buildspec.yml. So really what it's doing is it's actually launching an EC2 instance for you. Okay, so we're going to use CodeBuild, and I'm going to create a new project. Okay, so it's going to create a CodeBuild project, and then it's going to return us back to CodePipeline. So we're kind of jumping away, but I'm going to call this my CFD P4 build project. We're going to use, it's basically saying what environment do you want to use for your EC2 instance. I prefer to use Ubuntu. Standard runtime, and then the image, I'm just going to use the latest version of the Ubuntu image. I'm creating a new service role. And I'm not going to insert build commands. I'm going to use a build spec file. And you'll notice that it says by default it looks for a file named buildspec.yml in the source code root directory. Okay? So it's going to look in the source code root directory, meaning it's going to look in the root directory right here in the same location as package.json. It's going to look for a file called buildspec.yml. Okay, that's fine. The name's optional. By default, it's looking for a file buildspec.yml. I usually type that in here, but it is optional. I'm not naming this out of convention. Okay, and then I'm going to continue to the code pipeline. And I am going to leave the site, so it's just closing this browser window that got opened. So it created my code build project. I'm going to do it in a single build in US East. So US East 2 is where that's coming from. I'm going to go ahead and hit next. And now it's asking, how do I want to deploy this? I want to deploy it to, you notice there's different options of where I can deploy it, but I'm going to go ahead and deploy it to S3. And the bucket that I want, I've already set up a bucket for it, so it finds the bucket. And then what happens is it actually deploys it as a zip file. So the output gets deployed as a zip file. I want to extract that zip file before I deploy, so it'll be unzipped before deployment. So I'm going to choose that, and then I'm going to hit next. And it gives me a confirmation or a review of all the things that we just chose about this code pipeline. And I'm going to go ahead and create the pipeline. And once I create the pipeline, it's really going to do three things. It's going to grab the source code. That'll be fairly quick if things are successful. So you'll see it's in progress right now because I just created the pipeline, and eventually I'll get a green check mark saying, yep, it was successful. Okay, so it succeeded. And then it gets into the build phase. The build phase actually does take some time. It's not an immediate snap of your fingers and the build happens, because remember, it's launching an EC2 instance and then doing a node install and then grabbing the React dependencies and building the project. So it's doing a lot of stuff in the build that actually does take some time. It's fairly quick, but it's not instantaneous. But you'll notice that it eventually failed, so it gets into this auto retry attempt, but it's going to fail. Okay, and then eventually, if the build would succeed, we'd get to the deploy where it would deploy our project out to S3. Okay, so it does try to auto retries the build phase. Eventually it's going to fail. Okay, so it's in progress right now, and it tries twice, but you'll notice that it eventually fails. And if I view the details of why it failed, it's going to tell me that it downloaded the source code file, but ultimately here's the error message: YAML file error message. Couldn't find the source buildspec.yml file. No such file or directory. Okay, so remember when we were creating our code build project, we said that it was expecting a buildspec.yml file in our source code at the same location as package.json. Well, we don't have that yet. Okay, so there's really two things that we've done, or two things that we need to do. We modified our source code file, and you can see in Visual Studio Code it's basically saying, hey, there's something going on. app.js has been modified. Okay, and it has. Okay, so that's fine. But then the other thing that we did was, or that we need to do, is we need to add that buildspec.yml file to our project. Okay, so if I am over here on my desktop, I'm just going to move that buildspec.yml file that I have into our project 4 folder. Okay, so here's the buildspec.yml file. It's no longer on my desktop. It's in my project. Okay, so I'm going to do a git add of buildspec.yml. I'm going to do a git commit. Okay, so I'm going to do a git commit. My message is going to be modified app.js to Madison, Wisconsin, and added buildspec.yml file. Okay, so I added those two changes, and now that I've committed that, now I want to push the changes. Okay, so I've pushed those changes. If I go out to GitHub, you'll notice the build spec files here. Okay, so that's good. And then the app.js file, you'll notice that that didn't actually make it out. Okay, so it didn't make it out because I didn't add it to be committed. Okay, so when I did the add, if I scroll back up, the only thing I added was the build spec file. Okay, so my commit message is a little bit screwed up here. I did add the build spec, so ultimately my code pipeline is going to work. Okay, so my code pipeline is kicked off right now. So you'll notice it's in progress. It succeeded. It got the code from GitHub. You'll notice it got my message. Okay, the build is in progress, and because the build spec file's there and it's correct, the build process will go successfully, and then ultimately once the build process is successful, it'll deploy that code out to my S3 bucket. Okay, so I'm just kind of hanging out here as this is spinning. And like I said, the build process is not instantaneous, but it doesn't take a ton of time, so it's kind of neat to watch, at least initially, to make sure that the pipeline is working properly. But ultimately, I don't watch this on a day-to-day basis. What will end up happening is I'll just kind of take for granted this code pipeline, and my workflow will really be from my developer tools. I'll push to GitHub, and then ultimately I will just expect that to be deployed successfully. And for some reason, I screwed up when I created the bucket. I did not create it in US East 2, which is interesting. I thought I did. Looks like I created it in Virginia, which is annoying. So I'm going to go through the process of recreating this bucket really quick. I am actually going to steal the bucket policy. So I'll copy that bucket policy. But I'm just going to delete the bucket. Empty it first. Okay, so it's permanently deleted. And then I can delete the bucket. And then I want to make sure that I'm in Ohio. Sorry for the mix-up. So now I'm in Ohio. I'm going to create the bucket CFD P4. Not blocking public access. I have to confirm that. That's annoying that it didn't create the bucket. Okay, and if I choose a different name, I can do that. So let me go ahead and just say P4V2. Okay, so for version 2. And now I'm going to go ahead and create the bucket. Okay, so in this version 2 bucket, I'll go to the properties. I'm going to enable static website hosting. I set my index document and error document to index.html. I'm going to go to the permissions and I'm going to set up my bucket policy, and I have to add a new statement. My new statement is going to be exactly the same, but I am going to make sure that I capture the fact that I've named it V2 and save those changes. Okay, so now if I go to my properties and I go to this website, okay, so now I don't have this website. Let's close that one down. I don't have this website. I have to go back to my pipeline now and make a modification. Right, so if I go to my pipelines, and I have my pipeline here, I want to edit it. And when I edit it, I want to modify the deployment. I'm going to edit that stage. I want to modify where I'm deploying it to S3. So I'm no longer going to modify or deploy to CFD P4. I'm going to deploy to CFD P4 version 2. Okay, so I've made that modification. Okay, done. And I'm going to save the pipeline. Okay, and I could retry, I can just retry this stage. Maybe I can retry that stage. I haven't really tried that with the retry stage, but I could just release this change and it would kick off this whole process again. But what I want to do, instead of releasing, I guess I'll release the change. That's not a problem. I just want to make sure that that's actually deployed and saved. But what I do want to do is I want to make sure that app.js with Madison, Wisconsin actually gets deployed. So I'm going to come down here and do that GitHub change. So I'm going to do a git add of source app.js. I'm going to commit that. Okay, so I commit it, and then I'm going to push that out to GitHub. And by me pushing that out to GitHub, it's actually going to kick off this process. Okay, so you'll notice that the source is in progress right now. And hopefully this time we have it working. So we should get our source code. That shouldn't be a problem. And it'll confirm that we modified the app to include Madison, Wisconsin, so it gets our latest and greatest change from GitHub. That also included the build spec file. The build's in progress now. Okay, so that's hopefully successful. And again, it's kind of like watching paint dry when you're watching this build process. And I will say that CI/CD is super important, and I always think if I can set up CI/CD at the front end of my project, I'm going to save a ton of time when I'm actually doing my software development, so I don't have to worry about the deployment process, and I kind of have that figured out. So typically I like to set up the CI/CD process at the beginning of the project, and then what ends up happening is if I set it up at the beginning of the project and I get it working and it's successful and working the way I'd expect, I forget about it and I kind of forget the details of that CI/CD project. So it's not something that you touch every day, but it's super important, super helpful to actually set up at the front end of your project so you're not always worrying about that deployment process. Okay, so eventually the build's in progress. The deployment it looks like it succeeded for the old version. Okay, so it eventually succeeded for the old version, so it was able to deploy. And my guess is that we don't even have to go through this process of watching the build be successful. And my guess is that the website is going to show up here because it grabbed the old file. Okay. Okay, so you'll notice it's hello world right now. And then once this pipeline actually completes, when the build actually completes, this is taking a little longer than usual. Okay, so a minute ago, eventually it succeeds. Okay, so we modified the app to include Madison, Wisconsin. That looks like an updated change. And then the deployment happens really fast. Okay, so now I expect, because I made that change in GitHub, that the React applet will then follow suit. So this is out in the cloud, and you'll notice that when I refresh this, it automatically picks up those changes for me. Okay, so my normal workflow for a CI/CD project is I'm working locally in Visual Studio Code. I make changes to the different files. I add new components. I update the application. I then add them to GitHub or to Git locally. I commit them locally, and then I push them to my remote repository. And that push process initiates the whole CI/CD pipeline. And that CI/CD pipeline initiation looks like the following. It grabs the code from GitHub. So it gets the source code from GitHub. Then it kicks off our build process. So there's a build project that kicks off, and it installs Node and NPM. It runs the npm install, and then it runs the npm run build, and that's all defined in our buildspec.yml file. Okay, so that's all defined here. So it does the npm install, the npm run build, and then once that's complete, it then deploys our code out to our S3 bucket. One thing I do want to say is with our S3 bucket, so if I look at my bucket, we created this CFD P4v2, and if I refresh these objects, you'll notice that I see my React application that's here. This is what's actually deployed. If I go back over to the buckets, this CodePipeline US East 2 with this randomized number, this was created for me. This is the artifact that got created from the CodeBuild CodePipeline process. Okay, so initially we get a deployment here to this CodePipeline bucket, and then ultimately it extracts that from here. So it extracts it from here to the bucket destination. So if you have a strange bucket in S3, that bucket is required for the CodePipeline to work. Okay? So don't delete this bucket. This bucket is necessary for the CodePipeline to work, but ultimately it's a temporary storage solution so that it can extract those files into the actual destination. Okay, so this is basically an implementation of this CI/CD process. So we have Visual Studio Code creating a React application. We push the code out to GitHub. Once we push it out to GitHub, AWS CodePipeline gets involved, does its work of grabbing the source code, building it, and deploying it out to S3. Okay, and that's our continuous integration, continuous deployment lifecycle that we can work in. So that we don't have to actually worry about the deployment so not only do we not have to worry about the deployment, but we know that the deployment is consistent and accurate the way we want it to be.